I'm based on my family's farm out in far western New South Wales near Broken Hill. And it's a gorgeous part of the country. If you haven't had the opportunity to come out to Broken Hill, it's this expansive red plains horizons. We've got these sapphire blue skies like we do today. It's an amazing semi-arid environment, although it's more arid than semi these days. And it's a landscape that I absolutely fell in love with when my parents purchased it when I was 12 years old. The unfortunate thing is, when my parents purchased, it was the year 2000. And as many of you might recall, the year 2000 was the start of the decade-long Millennium Drought. And so our introduction to agriculture was quite a steep learning curve. And it became very quickly apparent to us just how interconnected we are to the natural world. That as farmers, we are very much dependent on that rainfall, on the temperatures, on that community stability. So during the Millennium Drought, yes, we had little to no rainfall for about 10 years. We had to sell our livestock, which we had only just purchased. We watched the dams evaporate, the vegetation disappear. We saw the impacts that that drought had on our rural community, on the people in Broken Hill, of shops closing, of people moving out of town, of the mental health impacts. And it was the Millennium Drought that really sparked my interest in learning more about climate change, because my dream was to take on the family farm. And when I started reading about the projections of where we're going as a world, I became increasingly concerned, both of the environmental changes and the social challenges that flow from them, but also that there was a lack of action. There was a lack of leadership on these huge challenges that were bearing down upon us. So I started learning about the challenges of a rapidly growing global population who are asking more and more of this planet. That by this time tomorrow, there will be nearly 250,000 new mouths to feed. And if that wasn't concerning enough, we're currently losing productive land. Arable land, pastures, forests are disappearing, and at a rate that far outpaces the Earth's ability to restore and replenish these areas. There are global trends of rural to urban migration and a growing disconnect between people and the systems that actually feed and clothe them. So the world that my parents grew up in, that my grandparents knew, is incredibly different from the world it is now. And I actually reflect on when my grandmother was born, there was 1.5 billion people on the planet. Today, there are 7.5 billion. So we live in a hungrier world with population growth driving food demand. We live in a wealthier world where there's an increasing number of new middle income population, which is increasing their consumption of food and fibers, particularly dairy and meat products. We have changing customers who are choosier, information empowered, who have expectations of provenance and ethics. And again, yes, there's this disconnection between urban and rural communities. We have new technologies. And these new technologies are changing the way that we produce food, that we transport food, that we manufacture and consume it. But we're also in for this bumpier ride. So social, economic, and environmental change is reshaping the world and our farming systems. So I just want to do a bit of climate science 101, and I'm sure you're all very much across climate change science, but it's good to have a refresher, because when we do need to explain what climate change is to our family and friends, it's good to have it firmly set in our minds. So solar radiation in the form of light waves passes through the atmosphere, and most of this radiation is absorbed by the Earth. Some energy is radiated back into space in the form of infrared waves. And some of this outgoing infrared radiation is trapped by Earth's atmosphere and warms the planet. But as we put more greenhouse gases into our atmosphere, it acts like a blanket around the Earth, and that blanket becomes thicker. So more of that outgoing infrared radiation is trapped, so our Earth becomes hotter. So what are the biggest sources of greenhouse gases? Well, we've got air transport, we've got the production of fossil fuels, we've got forest burning, land transport, we've got fertilization of crops in agricultural systems, we've got the burning of crops. We've got industrial processes, we've got coal mining, and we've got thawing permafrost. So each individual, each business, each sector has a footprint upon this planet. Now, I find this an interesting graph that it's tracking along the global average temperatures for the last 130 years, actually. And as you'll see, as it moves along, the global temperatures are becoming warmer, and those warmer temperatures are the yellows, the oranges, and the reds. So here we are in the 1920s, so this is when my grandparents were born. Into the 1930s, the 1940s now. Here we are moving into the 1950s, so this is when my parents were born. 1960s, 1970s. So I'm born here.
Cool.
1990s. So 2000, so anyone with teenage grandkids, they're born here. Anyone with the really small grandkids, they're born now.
Cool.
So as you can see, year after year, season after season, records are being smashed in high temperatures, in low rainfall. And for anyone under the age of 43, we have never known a year of global average temperatures or below. So on my family's farm, we have 500-year-old eucalyptus, river red gums in our ephemeral creeks, which are dying at the moment. And these are significant temporal markers in our landscapes. I mean, they've survived 500 years. Something has fundamentally changed now. In summertime, this past summer, for example, we had over 3 weeks, over 40 degrees temperature. That's a problem for sheep because ewes, female sheep exposed to temperatures over about 35, 36, they have reduced fetal development, they have miscarriages. For male sheep, the rams, temperatures over 42 degrees or so, they become sterile. So these extreme high temperatures mean that us as farmers are able to produce less and less. And that's a concern for everyone because we're producing the food that everyone eats. In summertime, we're now also recording open ground temperatures reaching 70 degrees Celsius. So last year we did extensive plantings on our farm of native plant species. And unfortunately, we probably have about 10% of those seedlings still remaining because they literally are baking in the soil in those extreme high temperatures and the low rainfalls that we are receiving. So climate change is definitely not a concern for the future or for the other side of the world. It is a concern right here, right now. So agriculture, what role does it play in all of this? Well, agriculture holds a very unique position in climate change in that it is part of the problem. It is one of the most vulnerable and exposed sectors to the impacts of climate change. And it is also a very important part of the solution. So I'll now go through these three aspects of it. So part of the problem, yeah, farmers, we do produce greenhouse gas emissions. Methane from ruminants. So ruminants are livestock with 4 stomachs like cattle, sheep, goats. We produce nitrous oxide from the application of nitrogen fertilizers to our crops, like urea. Our carbon monoxide from the vehicles that we use on our farms. We also use and remove vegetation. We graze grasses and shrubs. We remove trees. We extract soil nutrients and organic matter. We compact soil from livestock, and with vehicles, we use water resources. And we're one of the most vulnerable sectors to the impacts of climate change. So there are environmental impacts, droughts, floods, forest fires, and increasing intensity and frequency of these extreme weather events. We're also seeing changes in distribution and prevalence of pests and diseases for livestock and crops. Higher temperatures result in higher evaporation rates, which means less soil moisture. So you actually need more rainfall to replenish that soil moisture. And as we're receiving less rainfall, higher temperatures, the effectiveness of rainfall is actually decreasing. So with this less rainfall, we're receiving less inflows into our river systems. We then, of course, have the social impacts. So loss of jobs, because if farmers aren't earning as much money, they're employing less people. That often leads to people moving away from rural communities to urban centres. That's obviously results in economic impact. So less income for both the farmers and the agricultural sector, and also less income into these small rural communities. And also the cost of remediation. So if higher temperatures means drier soils, which are more prone to erosion, the cost of actually remediating, fixing up those soil erosion problems becomes greater. But this is the good part. Agriculture is part of the solution. And there's a lot of words on this slide here, but my main point is that there are so many ways we can be addressing climate change, so many ways we can be dealing with the big challenges we face. So very quickly, ways that we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions from farms. I mean, we can do low and no-till cropping. We can apply fertilizers better, and that includes, organic fertilizers as well as synthetics. Not leaving the soil bare, using diversified crops like perennials, like native species, which are better suited to our climate and soil types. Integrated crop livestock systems, working on ruminant genetics and feed so they actually produce less methane. We can look at alternative proteins, like insects, like algae, like seaweeds. Renewable energies is obviously a very exciting part. Solar, wind, biomass, methane. But the great thing is farmers have these expansive parcels of land, so they can actually host solar panels, wind turbines. And if they are the ones to host this renewable energy and produce it in excess, then they can sell it back to the grid. And that is a way that they can receive secondary and stable sources of income, which can help them ride out the rough times like the drought. We can also look at electric and hydrogen-powered vehicles and machinery. I've got women there as my second last point, which is very important on a global scale because women's education is very important in family planning and family nutrition, what people are actually eating. And food waste is obviously a big issue too, because we're wasting way too much food around the world, both on farm and in the transportation and distribution processes. I think it's around 30 to 40% of food is actually wasted. And how do we actually draw down greenhouse gas emissions that we've put up in excess? Well, we can restore degraded lands by planting trees, by ensuring we've got good vegetation cover that can capture and sequester carbon. Nitrogen fixing bacteria on soil, and plants like legumes, integrated crop livestock systems also can increase soil carbon. So there are lots of ways that we can be addressing these big problems we face. And when we start addressing problems like climate change, we see a lot of benefits flow. Environmental benefits such as land becoming more productive, more resilient to change, because having high carbon levels in the soil, high organic matter levels in the soil, actually makes it more fertile to grow crops, to run livestock. That leads to then social benefits, better human health. By having cleaner air, cleaner water, more nutritious food, people are, both physically and mentally better off. Community stability, with less people migrating out of rural communities. If we have these vibrant and resilient rural communities, that's good for family connections. And then obviously there's the economic benefits of acting on climate change, in that when we, imagine these new industries, there are new jobs, there are varied income sources. We can also increase product value on farm, because as consumers become increasingly aware of their carbon footprints, they are seeking out products with higher social and environmental standards. And if we as farmers can prove that we've produced this food in the most environmentally responsible way with the lowest carbon footprint, then we can actually ask a higher price of it. So this actually increases our value and opens up new market opportunities for farmers. So how do we achieve all this? Because all that sounds great. Well, we need to make a few changes within the system, within the way that we're currently running the show. So that starts with policy change. Obviously, we need guidance from our politicians on how to achieve net zero. And this will then give certainty to investors who are more likely to put their money towards a future that, we're being told this is what we're setting out to achieve. By removing fossil fuel subsidies, by putting a price on carbon, by incentivizing renewable energies, these are great policy changes that can help accelerate the change that we require. Capital change. So money directed to research, development and extension, divesting from fossil fuels, companies disclosing their carbon emissions. So people understand, what businesses and companies are, putting their money towards, and, that consumer influence will shift the money. So when people, speak to their banks about, and superannuation companies, their energy companies about, their carbon footprint, their role in all of this, that's when we see these social pressures being put on these groups. So the social change is the education on climate impacts and the solutions, and the empowerment, giving people the skills and the capacity to change. It's also about changing the narrative, I think, because we do hear a lot about the doom and the gloom, about how bad and challenging the situation is, and that's entirely true. But we actually need to be painting that vision of what we want to achieve and working out the steps how to get there. Because I, hand on heart, know that it is possible to achieve that better vision, but we do have to act quickly. We do have to act now. But it's not an issue of technology or know-how that is holding us up. It is a people problem. It is people getting their act together and making this happen. So I want to give a few examples, just 3 examples of how Australian farmers are creating change. So they're working with policymakers. So I'm, very proudly involved with a group called Farmers for Climate Action. And about 5 years ago, a group of 30 or so farmers met in the Blue Mountains. And we had a discussion about, we're all feeling the impacts of climate change on our farms, even though we're located in vastly different, regions around the country and different industries. We're all concerned about the future of our farms. And we don't feel like our elected representatives are hearing our concerns or acting on our concerns. So that was one of the reasons that Farmers for Climate Action formed, because we wanted to make sure that there was this a whole united voice in the agricultural sector, being supported, that was able to engage with our industry bodies, that was able to engage well with our policymakers. So this photo at the bottom of the screen here, last year we headed to Canberra and sent a delegation of farmers there to meet with elected representatives right across the board. And we produced this report of how climate change is impacting the agriculture sector and what we need to do about it. And by acting on it, how we become more productive as food producers, how it improves our social and economic stability. The other example is farmers sharing their story in the media. And this is what I'm referring to in, changing the narrative. There is this disconnect between urban and rural audiences, and I believe that it's very important that farmers are sharing their story to help people living in the cities actually understand what a drought in rural Australia means to the food on their plate. And people are really interested in this information. They love hearing about it. And I think, a lot of Australians, they hold farmers and, the wide brown land very close to their heart. They want to read about what's happening and to learn how they can get involved with helping some of these issues that we face. So part of Farmers for Climate Action has been training farmers of how to give presentations, to speak with the radio, to write letters to the editor, to make sure that we are able to educate people on the impacts of climate change, to engage them with our stories, and to also empower them to feel like they are involved and they can do something about these issues. And I'm also involved with a group called Young Farming Champions. And this is a program that trains young people in rural Australia to share their stories, to go into schools, either virtually, which is what I do. I do Zoom lessons into schools in Sydney, or they send young farmers in there personally before COVID. And you run classes for the school on, this is where sheep are produced. This is where wool is produced. This is, a chicken operation or a cotton operation. And the kids ask the most brilliant questions. They're absolutely fascinated by life on the land. They love seeing the images of the cattle and the horses. And we're trying to encourage young people to not only, consider where their food is coming from, but also think about agriculture as a career option too, because there is so much exciting work being done in the farming sector, and people working in this sector are making, a meaningful contribution to food security, to the protection of natural habitats and wildlife, to the vibrancy of our rural communities. So I think it's a super exciting place for people to think about, I want to be involved in agriculture. I want to try and make this sector the best it possibly can be. So my key messages from the presentation are that the science is clear. We know what's causing climate change. We know we have to act. We also know that climate change is impacting farming, the productivity, the profitability today. And although that these challenges might seem quite daunting and overwhelming sometime, it's important to note that farmers actually play an incredibly role in the solutions, and that there are so many solutions out there just waiting to be tapped into. And we can achieve those, that big vision that we dream of, and the social, the economic, the environmental benefits that come with it by implementing and driving change. And we can accelerate this change, this transition to a low carbon society through policy change, through capital change, through social change. It's about changing minds and behavior. And the change starts with all of us today. We can't sit back and wait for someone else to step up and make these changes that we need. I think it is time for all of us to be those leaders that we have been waiting for. So thanks very much for listening to my presentation, and I welcome any questions and discussions.
Thank you, Anika. That was great.
Yes.
Oh, getting applause and thumbs up, all that sort of stuff. It was great.